All right, folks, let's get started with chapter 17. And here's what it looks like. It's our first painting. Um, this came from American artist Francis Davis Millet soon after his return from Asia, where he served as a newspaper correspondent during the Spanish-American War. This painting depicts a well-dressed couple in a parlor filled with maps of the world and goods and memories from Asia. In the wake of the emergence of the U.S. as the ruler of an overseas empire, it suggests that manifest destiny involves not just territorial expansion, but also the acquisition of the spoils of travel and war. So these are the four sections that we'll be covering, and we'll start with this one. And here's your focus question. Like workers, farmers in the South and West face growing economic insecurity as agricultural prices fell and economic dependency on merchants and banks increased. Sharecropping kept millions of black and white Southern farmers in poverty, and an oversupply of world cotton led to dramatic price decreases that threatened Southern farmers' livelihoods and property. These farmers soon blamed their woes on railroads' high freight rates, high interest rate loans from bankers and merchants, and the fiscal policies of the federal government that reduced the money supply and farm prices. In response, farmers organized the Farmers Alliance in Texas in the late 1870s, which quickly spread to dozens of states. The alliance at first stayed away from politics and established cooperatives called exchanges to finance and market crops. But when banks refused to loan money for the exchanges, the alliance proposed the sub-treasury plan. The federal government would establish warehouses where farmers could store their crops until sold, and by using the crops as collateral, the government would issue loans directly to farmers at low interest rates, ending their dependence on bankers and merchants for credit. Demands for the sub-treasury led the alliance to politics. In the early 1890s, the alliance formed the People's Party, called Populist, the era's greatest political insurgency. The Populists appealed not just to farmers but to all producers, including miners, industrial workers, and small businessmen. But most of its supporters were cotton and wheat farmers in the South and West. The Populists organized massive educational campaigns using pamphlets, newspapers, and revival style mass meetings throughout the country. This was the last expression of the 19th century idea that America was a commonwealth of small producers whose freedom rested on individual ownership of productive property and the dignity of labor. But the populists were forward looking, embracing scientific methods of agriculture and modern technologies that made large scale cooperatives possible, such as the railroad, telegraph, and national market, and they wanted the federal government to regulate them for the public interest, a very 20th century idea. Further, the populists believed the government could move beyond partisan conflict to promote the public good, a vision soon to be adopted by the progressive movement and later politicians including Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama. The Populists adopted a famous platform at their 1892 Omaha convention. It proposed many measures to restore democracy and economic opportunity for ordinary Americans, some of which came to pass in the next century, such as the direct election of U.S. senators, government control of currency, graduated income tax, low cost public financing for farmers, and workers' rights to organize unions. The platform also called for national ownership of railroads to allow farmers to inexpensively get their crops to market. In some parts of the South, the Populists heroically tried to unite black and white farmers on a common political and economic program, but the barriers were too great. Racism, the legacy of the Civil War, and the fact that many white populists were landowning farmers while black farmers were tenants and agricultural laborers facing a different set of problems all militated against such an alliance. Black farmers organized their own Cotton Farmers Alliance, whose strikes were suppressed by white authorities, some of whom were even sympathetic to white populists. While white populists were hardly anti racist, some recognized that whites would have to appeal to blacks in order to break the Democratic Party's hold on the South and its opposition to reform. And in a few places like North Carolina, white and black populists together won state elections. In most of the South, however, Democrats defeated the populists by mobilizing whites to vote against Negro supremacy, intimidating blacks, and rigging elections. The populists also engaged the reform efforts of farmer and middle class women and endorsed women's suffrage in many states. In 1892, the populist candidate for president, James Weaver, won more than 1 million votes, and the party carried 5 western states and elected 3 governors and 15 members of Congress. When a severe depression in 1893 intensified conflict between labor and capital, it seemed that the populists might gain the votes of industrial workers who had traditionally supported the two major parties. Employers used state or federal authority to protect their economic power and suppress labor unrest. In May 1894, the federal government dispersed Coxey's Army, a march of the unemployed led by Jacob Coxey, an Ohio businessman that converged on the nation's capital. Also in 1894, workers in the company owned town of Pullman, Illinois, called a strike to protest a reduction in wages. The American Railway Union, with 150,000 members, announced they would not handle Pullman cars. The boycott crippled national rail service, and through President Grover Cleveland, an injunction was obtained that ordered the strikers back to work. The strike collapsed after the union's leaders, including Eugene V. Debs, were jailed. The Supreme Court later confirmed their sentences and approved the use of injunctions against striking labor unions. The dissolution of the Knights of Labor and the rise of the American Federation of Labor, in the AFL, in the 1890s signaled in the labor movement a similar move away from broad reforms to more limited aims. Strikes like the Pullman strike seemed to show that direct confrontations with capital devastated workers' organizations. Unions, declared Samuel Gompers, the AFL's founder and longtime president, should avoid seeking economic independence, politics, or the utopian goals of groups like the Knights. Gompers and the AFL thought unions should simply bargain with employers for higher wages and better working conditions. Like Booker T. Washington, Gompers used the language of the era's business culture. His strategy was known as business unionism. He embraced the idea of freedom of contract and turned it into an argument against the interference of judges with workers' rights to organize unions. In the 1890s, union membership recovered from its decline in the late 1880s. However, the AFL abandoned the Knights' ideal of labor solidarity and restricted its membership to skilled workers, a small minority which effectively excluded most blacks, women, and new European immigrants. The AFL became strong in trades with highly skilled workers like printing and construction, but was weak or non existent in basic industries like steel or the factories that dominated the economy. In 1894, the Populists doubled their efforts to appeal to industrial workers, and in state and congressional elections that year, with the Depression worsening, voters abandoned the Democrats. The populist vote in rural areas increased, but most workers did not vote populist. Few populist demands spoke to workers' needs, as their calls for higher agricultural prices would raise food costs for workers and diminish the value of their wages, and the movement's Protestant and revivalist culture alienated Catholic and immigrant workers. Urban workers instead voted for the Republicans, who argued that higher tariff rates would revive the economy by protecting American manufacturing and workers from imports and cheap foreign labor. The Republicans gained a massive 117 seats in the House. In 1896, the Democrats and Populists united behind William Jennings Bryan, a young congressman from Nebraska. Bryan had won the Democratic nomination in a speech that captured the fears and hopes of farmers. Bryan called for the free coinage of silver, which was the unrestricted minting of silver money, and he used biblical imagery to condemn the gold standard in perhaps the most famous lines of political oratory in American history. Quote, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." End quote. Bryan's demand for free silver was the latest expression of a long-standing view that increasing the amount of currency in circulation would raise the prices of farmers' crops and make it easier for them to pay their debts. Bryan's nomination represented a shift in Democratic leadership away from elites, but Bryan's appeal was highly religious and revivalist and influenced by the social gospel. Republicans argued that gold was the only honest currency and that abandoning it would prevent economic recovery by scaring creditors away from making loans. They nominated Governor William McKinley of Ohio, who had shepherded the highly protectionist McKinley Tariff in Congress in 1890. The 1896 election was the first modern presidential election. The Republicans poured an unprecedented amount of money into a highly organized campaign that used a massive educational effort directed against the Democrats' calls for free silver. The results showed a nation divided along regional lines. McKinley won the election with the votes of industrial states in the Northeast and Midwest. Labor conflict did not produce political results. Party politics seemed to mute class conflict, not reinforce it. Industrial America, from workers to industrialists, voted solidly Republican and continued to do so for years. McKinley's victory shattered the political stalemate of the previous 20 years, launching a period of Republican dominance that would last until the 1930s, and marked a pinnacle in voter participation, which ever since has been in decline. Today, only around half of the electorate casts ballots. So, that's the end of section 1. We'll be back with section 2.